Well, good morning to everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. This is Café Con Luis, and today we're talking about the changing face of IT and predictions for 2021. We've got wonderful guest Zeus Kerravala with us today. Thank you for joining us, Zeus. I'll introduce you shortly again. As I said, my name is Luis, and just a little bit of housekeeping. Everybody is joining on mute. However, the Q&A panel should be open if you have any questions along the way and would like to chat with us about anything. The chat, however, is ephemeral, so we don't get a record of the chat afterwards. So if you want to have a question that we can address offline or anything like that, please use the Q&A panel. And if you're having any video or audio issues, Tracy is helping us logistically behind the scenes in case you have any issues. We are recording the session as well, and we'll follow up in an email with the recording to the session as well, in case you want to share with your team or watch afterwards as well. I'm Luis. I've been an MSP owner since 2006, as well as obviously we're all working in SaaS for the last few years, and having joined SolarWinds earlier this year in April. And so I sort of have the unique vantage point of having the so-called ear to the ground on a lot of sort of the challenges of the MSP and the plight of growth, and sort of keeping track of what's happening strategically in the industry and things like that. And it's such a great opportunity to get somebody like Zeus on the line, who has spent so much time with the technology leaders and looking into technologies and emerging technologies, to give us some of his insights today. Without further ado, welcome Zeus to the show today. Thank you so much for joining us. Please give us a little bit of an intro about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Luis. Appreciate it. I've been a research analyst with my own firm for about 10 years now. Before that, I was actually the Yankee Group for 10 years. I was the chief research officer there. And my background's a bit different than most analysts. A lot of analysts come out of, they're either former reporters or they worked in product marketing at a vendor. I've actually never worked at a vendor. I worked at a VAR for a while, so I sold the products, and I was in corporate IT at a CIO role for a while, so I bought the products, but I never made the products. And the other difference is most analysts have, a coverage area that they kind of live and die with from here to the end of time. I cover, the scope of networking, security, and communications, which is a big area, but I really only focus on the areas that are, the markets that are in transition, right? So, in networking 5 years ago, I didn't really look at any WAN technology because there wasn't anything going on. But now,
Right.
with the rise of SDWAN and SASE, it's a lot more interesting, right? So I tend to, change my coverage area based on markets that are emerging. So the way I always describe it is, if the value from the analyst is how much widgets did, how many widgets did you sell? There's a lot of firms that do that really well. So I'll focus more on the leading edge.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique position that you've sort of been on both sides of that coin, both as a VAR as well as a sort of a corporate IT purchaser in a way, because it's not often that happens. And so, the insight I guess you gain from some of that background is interesting, and hopefully that's helped inform a bit of your analyst positioning as well.
Yeah, I think so.
So for everyone's benefit today, sort of we're chatting about a few of these interesting topics. No particular order. We have some slides to sort of guide the conversation, but we kind of left them a little bit open for conversation. And we welcome some of your comments. The chat is also open. If you'd like to just have an ongoing conversation about any of the topics, feel free to jump in and opine. So I wanted to start off with this IT implications of the pandemic. And, obviously, actually, first things first, good thing I interrupted myself there. So because this is a coffee themed show, I have to ask the question, what's the best coffee you've ever had? I'm drinking the Yirgacheffe coffee today from Beachcomber, and I think you may have volunteered that you're having, like a good Canadian boy, some Tim Hortons earlier, but you probably have some kind of experience-based coffee favorite, hopefully.
No, not really. I'm not really a coffee aficionado. I kind of drink whatever's closest.
Yeah.
I live in Massachusetts most of the time, so that leans me towards Dunkin' Donuts, obviously. I'm not a big dark roast guy, so I really don't like Starbucks a whole lot. And when I am in Canada, I like to go to, I do like to go to, well, I got the sleeve on here, the Tim Hortons, right? So,
Timmy's, yeah.
But I went there because, they have these special edition Tim Horton hockey cards. And so being a Canadian boy, I like to do that. But as far as what coffee to drink, it's whatever's closest. And I don't really have a preference uh, for one versus other. I'm not a big, like I said, I'm not a big Starbucks fan, but just sort of the other half of my time is generally spent in the Bay Area. And, Starbucks is sort of big on the West Coast. And so I get funny looks from people when I'm trying to go somewhere.
we got a comment from Rodney that he likes his Nespresso Lungo, and Lungo just means long. We had an Nespresso here for a little while, but I just couldn't get enough coffee with the Nespresso, so I sort of switched to just the drip coffee, and I do this massive cup. It's like bigger than my face. So
I do like
that's
latte because then I don't have to put milk in, right? It's already in there.
yeah. Yeah, fair enough. We picked up a little espresso machine as a Christmas gift for us, and so now we're making afternoon lattes, and that's a lot of fun. So I wanted to ask you, the background you have is super interesting, having been in corporate IT, having been at a bar. What made you find yourself making a transition to being an analyst? Like, what was sort of that transition point?
So this is kind of a funny story. When I was in IT, I really didn't like industry analysts. Um, I um, I had just had an inquiry with the big analyst firm there that starts with G, whose name I'll leave nameless, and I was asking them about um, firewalls, and so they sent me a report on the 7 evaluation criteria to buy firewalls, and then it had said scale, price, performance, things like that, right? Didn't say what price to pay, didn't what scale to look for. It just had these sort of 7 generic um,
Hmm.
uh, criteria that I said to the guy, I said, I can apply this to dishwashers, right? Like there was nothing in here that really helped me make a decision. And and so I really didn't like dealing with industry analysts. And then a recruiter from Yankee Group called me, and he's like, we have an opening here to run our enterprise communications group or a networking group. Are you interested? And I'm like, are you kidding? I go, industry analysts. I said, industry analysts are a bunch of clowns, right? And he said, well, if you really think that, why don't you become one and do it differently? And I'm like, oh. And that was sort of interesting spin. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll
Challenge
take a look.
accepted. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I decided to jump in, and I thought I'd do it for 3 or 4 years and then go back to being a CIO. But what I realized was I really didn't like all the pressure that was on you when you were in corporate IT was just like you don't realize how much there is on you until you leave it, and it's not it's a very thankless job, right? And so I really, I kind of just jumped into this on a temporary basis. I thought I'd develop a bunch of new relationships in the vendor world and things like that that I'd be able to carry with me, but and then I realized I was kind of good at it, and I decided to stick with it. I think having the IT background actually has helped me, with credibility
Hmm.
with other IT people, because a lot of times it's hard to really have an appreciation for what IT people go through without having been one. It's people think it's an easy job, but it's not an easy job. And even when I read in the press and things that IT is falling behind and stuff like that, I do take some of those statements personal, because the environment has gotten so much more complex, that it's we've almost put our IT people in an unfair situation in some cases, because it's we always talk about like do more with less, right? Well, you can't do more with less. It's like that's sort of it's a weird statement to make, but that's what business leaders expect all the time. So.
Well, I feel a little bit of a parallel to my own life in that having been an MSP owner since 15 years now, I feel like the kind of conversation I can have with other MSPs, even now I'm in this sort of interesting marketing role at SolarWinds, is still a very peer-to-peer type conversation, and it just changes the dynamic entirely because we can immediately get into topics that I know are a challenge, and so that's actually one of the things we're trying to focus on is just how to better understand the challenges, because I think that breeds more interesting conversations. But this is exactly what this type of conversation today is so interesting, is because it sort of is addressing some of the challenges that people, they know they're there, but it's hard to sort of make time to talk about these things. Um, So this is one of those sort of life questions that I always ask. Is there anything you would have done differently or sooner? This is the hindsight being 2020 question.
Well, I'm a guy who's gotten divorced twice, so there's that part. Um,
So would you have gotten the divorce sooner, is what you're saying?
yeah, yeah, or just not got married. But if I take that out of it, from a career perspective, um, I don't know. I think all the experiences sort of shape you to where you are now.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Maybe I would have bought some Amazon stock, when it was, first
Oh,
founded or something like that. But
yeah. Stick me
yeah,
with the blade and turn it. Oh, that's horrible.
yeah. But I'm pretty happy with the way my career's turned out and things like that. So um, I don't, really have. I don't really sit around thinking, gee, I wish I had done that sooner. I would have taken up golf earlier. I didn't start playing until I was in my 20s, and I got down to as low as a 4 handicap for a while. But I think if I had started younger, I might have,
Hmm.
been able to, push that down to scratch or something like that. Maybe that's what.
I was having this conversation just yesterday as we were interviewing another channel friend of ours, and the comment I had is that I told a story about Doris Day, who's a famous Hollywood golden era actress and singer, and I've been a musician all my life, and one of the things I wanted to do was a Doris Day tribute CD because I've loved her music for a long time. And at one point, I thought to myself, it'd be great if I could send Doris Day a note and say, "Hey, thanks for inspiring me with your music." And I never did, and she passed away last year, and now I can never do that. So one of the things I constantly think about is not waiting when I have some of these things that I want to do or some of the things that I want to say. So that's been sort of my goal as of late, is to be more actionable with some of these things that come along. Well, thanks for the insight. So let's jump
Actually, one
into
thing
some of the.
about that, I think I would have worked a couple of years in Europe. I didn't really start going to Europe until it was later in my life, and I really liked it there. So I think that would have been fun to do. So
Yeah, I think about Europe a lot too. My wife being European, she's from Sweden, and I've been teasing her that we should go live in Europe at some point. And we got close earlier this year to having a conversation that sort of edged on the side of like, hey, let's consider this seriously, and we actually started looking at places in Sweden and stuff like that. But we immediately sort of roped that back in and went back to, oh well, we like it here though. Canada's great, and we have a pretty good situation here. So, but I constantly think about Europe. It's such an interesting place to me, the history and all that stuff. But now we can travel. Well, not right now, but soon we can travel again. Um, all right, IT implications. Man, this slide is bright. The um,
very
the
yellow.
challenge IT companies and MSPs in particular are having, sort of coming in and out and through the pandemic, has been interesting. I've been seeing it firsthand at my MSP, as well as I keep hearing from industry colleagues and partners that, there's more people working from home. Obviously, there's more people using devices that they have no information about, that they have no control over. And so I know you spent some time thinking about some of the challenges and implications of IT through, what is the pandemic currently. Just wanted your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think the one thing the pandemic taught us, from a business perspective, is that you really have to be prepared for anything. The only, I was in corporate IT when Y2K happened or didn't happen, depending on your perspective, since it was sort of
Yeah.
a non-event. But and that was sort of a profound change, right? We had to look at every system and things like that. And but that you kind of knew, you had a long time to know it was coming, right? The companies were working for a decade on planning for that. With this one, in really a couple of week time frame, everybody had to send all workers home, and the systems weren't ready to do that. The employees weren't ready to do that. Like we think of people like you and I who are kind of mobile professionals. I could sit anywhere and work, right? I'm in an Airbnb in Toronto, and I haven't really skipped a beat, work wise. But there's a lot of people out there that have never worked from home, and the whole concept of that is foreign. And there's
Sure.
certain professions like teaching and things and the legal industry and state and local government that just weren't set up for it. So I think from a business perspective, you really need to be prepared for anything and for those unknown unknowns. And that requires a lot of agility at the IT level. And so whatever, we're living in a world that's increasingly dynamic and distributed, and everything you do from an IT perspective has to be with that thought in mind. How do I make myself more agile, right? And you're only as agile as your least agile IT component. And so that requires everything from the way you build apps to the way you deploy networks, the type of compute you use. It's been one of the reasons why everybody pivoted to public cloud, and I think when you look out ahead, businesses have to be prepared for everybody to be in the office, nobody to be in the office, and every possible combination between, because we don't know how this is going to play out, right? And so I think from an IT perspective, it really sort of underscored the importance of just of overall agility, about being able to do things quickly. And some companies were good at that, and other ones weren't. And the ones that weren't really, struggled. I do think it created a forcing mechanism for companies that weren't really set up for the digital era either, right? You think of something as simple. We were talking about coffee, right? Think of something as, Starbucks for years has been trying to get people to use the mobile app, but people preferred to go in the store and stand in line, right? Versus using the mobile app order to pick up. But now you were forced to do that, right? And so, local coffee shops that maybe didn't even have that capability were forced to build that. We have menus on QR codes now, things like that.
Yeah.
And so the whole world kind of went digital overnight, but companies really had to revamp their underlying IT infrastructure, which is why you saw so much, change out towards cloud and stuff. And it's really a profound time for IT, because I don't know, like I said, the only other transition I remember where there was so much spend for one particular goal was Y2K, but we had a lot of notice that was coming. Right? So.
Yeah, I think the agility piece is interesting, because I've often talked a lot about how standardization of the stack, and by the stack I mean the tool set that MSPs or IT providers use to deliver their service, but how the standardization of the stack plays such a big role to obtain that agility, or to obtain that consistency and be able to adapt, or the concept of just being sort of the next gen MSP or next gen IT provider, meaning being adaptable to change, being able to pivot and shift with some of those things. But the standardization in the case of my MSP was the one thing that saved our bacon a bit, because we have a practice of always deploying, for example, a Cisco Meraki firewall, and we always set up VPN the same way, even if the customer may only not need it for like one or two people. But this sort of allowed a lot of that shift to happen very quickly without having to go into redesign every single customer network and do everything differently. So we kind of were thankful that we put some thought into a little bit of the stack and the standardization of how we deliver IT. And I think that's a big piece of the implications coming out of the pandemic, for sure.
Yeah, a lot of companies, and I lived through this, right? So when I was in IT, we did a lot of custom stuff. We had custom scripts. We, used a lot of homegrown tools. And the problem with that becomes when you have an employee change out, nobody has any idea how those things were built or worked, right? Mm-hmm. We had a lot of code that was written that way, and it creates a lot of problems. So to your point, the standardization and the following of best practices and things like that really can help help you navigate through these times of change. And make no mistake, we're moving into an era where this kind of rapid change we have is really becoming the norm, right? I don't think we're going to ever go back to the old way where IT had these long windows to of change management, right? I think this rapid innovation that we're in now is here to stay.
Yeah, I kind of have been seeing this coming a bit with even the likes of Apple, when they transitioned away from doing 3-year life cycles on OS releases to 1-year cycles on OS releases. And it's interesting to see sort of the long tail that vendors also had in supporting new OSs. They started to have to change their entire dynamic of releases as well to be able to stay behind sort of the OS changes. And we're not quite there. I think there's still a lot of vendors that hold you back because, we're not ready for the new OS and our team hasn't even begun looking at it yet. And they don't take advantage of the developer programs to sort of get in early on some of the beta releases. But this is sort of an interesting area where IT companies themselves, I think, could also be doing a lot better, is to spend time thinking like a developer, spend time with the pre-releases and beta releases of OSs, testing their stack and testing their systems, and be able to change along with the vendors that are driving a lot of this change at the core. So
I'll tell you, a lot of vendors have learned though. Last year at Dell Technology World, in the analyst Q&A, Michael Dell was asked about, kind of the pace of change and stuff. And he said he learned something through the kind of rise and fall of Dell. When virtualization first came around, he remembered like thinking, well, this is bad, right? For Dell, because people now need less servers. And so Dell was very anti-virtualization. And what he learned was if a transition is good for the customer, they're going to do it, right? And no matter how hard you try and hold it back, if it's good for the customer, they're going to do it. And so now he wants to kind of be on the leading edge of that. Chuck Robbins, the CEO of Cisco, I had a chance to ask him this question too when he first became CEO about Cisco really trying to hold back software-defined networking. And he said that was a mistake. He said there's a lot of customer benefits, and he said, I'll promise you, when he's CEO, he'll never ever do that again. If there's a transition that's happening, Cisco wants to be on the leading edge of that, not the trailing edge, right? And so if their customers need help, they want to be the ones to help them. And so I think the vendor community is slowly starting to learn here that when things are good for customers, they're going to do it. And the vendors that don't really understand that, I think, are going to fall by the wayside pretty quickly. So.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You've had a chance to chat with these folks firsthand about these types of things. I think also part of that is that the vendors have to adopt an educational role, I think, in some of these early technologies or the early stages of these emerging technologies, because even though maybe corporate IT or some people that are really ahead of the curve in terms of adopting new tech or being able to afford, pilot groups of new tech and things like that, oftentimes the rest of the market is not ready or they don't understand how this applies. I think SD-WAN is actually one of those interesting examples where we've sort of been on the receiving end of the educational aspect of SD-WAN for a while. And there's, places where it matters a bunch, like corporate IT and multi-network locations and stuff like that. But you look at SMB and all with a single location, and all of a sudden SD-WAN kind of loses all its significance. And so it's interesting also to see how some trends sort of stop at the transition from SME to SMB. So I find that fascinating.
You can use some SD-WAN principles, though, for SMBs, single locations, around the multipath capabilities if you buy 2 broadband connections, right? I think we'll talk about this in a bit when you ask about predictions, but the use of 5G or even 4G technologies as secondary network link, things like that. I think that can help SMBs. And the thing with network today is when you look at the kind of building blocks of digital, cloud, mobility, IoT, they're all network centric, right? So it's fair to say that for most businesses, the network is the business, and so that's been an interesting change to see as well.
Yeah, at least in the small business world, what I'm seeing a ton of, sort of from the MSP vantage point, is obviously a little bit smaller in scale, is maybe more of the transition to being able to work from anywhere. And Rodney asked this question, what will happen after COVID? We were all working at home, but should we focus on working from anywhere? And I think that's kind of been my own motto in my MSP, is the idea of how we built our stack was like, I wanted to be able to, if I lost my computer, be able to go buy a new computer and pull up all my tools and start working, within the hour on anything I needed to be able to do. And sort of being decentralized like that, I thought was a really interesting concept early on. And so that's kind of how I think, or I help my own customers think about their IT strategy, is decentralizing a little bit. And it's tough with some industries like AEC, architecture and engineering construction, where they work with a lot of large files and they want them on a server. And some of the old habits and stuff like this are a little bit of a transition. But we'll talk about digital transformation in a bit as well, because that's an interesting topic. Automation and scalability, I think, is another interesting piece of this. The sort of do more with less, you mentioned that earlier, is I think one of those big things that people say all the time, but what does it actually mean? What can I feasibly automate, and what does scalability mean even for a small MSP? And I'll start simply with my own one example of this that I think is relevant to many MSPs is especially in the situation of the pandemic where going on site is a challenge, where sometimes we work with small businesses that are growing very quickly and we can't sort of go to multiple locations. We're starting to look more and more at the vendor programs that exist, like Microsoft Autopilot and doing zero touch deployment workflows, or Apple's Business Manager and their automated deployment technologies. And this kind of thing have been super important for us to automate a lot of the provisioning of devices and getting stuff rolled out to end users and being able to do it remotely and do it quickly and securely as well. But what are some of your thoughts? What are you seeing in the industry about the automation and scalability piece?
Well, to me, automation is really the key for survival of IT. If there's one piece of advice I give IT people now, is if you're doing things today, and we do a lot of things in IT today that really aren't beneficial to your resume, right? Forget your company, right? Be selfish, think about your resume. If there's things you're doing in your job that aren't going to help your resume, don't do them, right? Find a way to automate them out of your job. And, as you were talking about provisioning devices and things like that, no one's going to hire you because you can provision a device anymore, right? So if you can automate those capabilities, you're going to get it done faster. You're going to have fewer errors. Like IT, and I'm a former IT person, so I'm not picking on IT, but IT creates a lot of their own problems.
Yeah, so true.
We're doing a lot of repetitive tasks, and we make errors, and automation can help all of that. So when I first started writing about automation, and I write in a lot of pubs, right? I write in CIO Magazine and eWeek and SiliconANGLE and Network World and things. I used to get a lot of feedback from people that they didn't really think automation was ready for prime time, and I think a lot of it was they were just scared of it because the word is going to take their job. But it's going to make a good engineer a great engineer, because it's going to free up a lot of time that they spend doing a lot of the mundane things that really they don't like to do, even backing things up, or even if you want to be able to update your network and change an ACL, right, instead of hitting every router, if you can do it once from a centralized console and automate the propagation of that stuff, that's so much better. And so automation and scale actually go hand in hand because it lets you scale better. And the way I think about automation is, think of it like like an automobile today, right? There are certain things people are good at, and there's certain things they're not. And so one of the great innovations in a car has been parallel park assist, because most people stink at parallel parking their car, right? And so that's a task that's kind of hard, that automation has actually helped, right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't know how to do it, but you can use automation to simplify that process. And and even like with driving, the ability to turn cruise control on and sort of automate your speed up and down is so much easier than it's on a long drive. If you're driving 10 hours or something, than having to always make sure you're watching the speedometer, making sure you're not speeding, that the adaptive cruise control. And so we do use automation in a lot of our lives to make our tasks, to make our lives easier, but we haven't really done a very good job of it in IT. And I think automation is really the next big one of the next big things for IT, because there's more machine learning based ones. And so we're not automating for the sake of automating, we're using actual analytics and data to understand what to automate, right? And even to the point where, when I was a network engineer, I tried building what would have been considered an SD-WAN today. Back in the 90s, I was using a bunch of broadband connections and MPLS, well, it was ATM and frame back then, to try and build a sort of better performing network. And we were doing voice over frame relay, so I had voice going over certain PVCs and not others. But if I wanted to move them around, I had to do all that manually. Well, SD-WAN automates that now, so you can get close to real time, right? And so automation does help. Like I said, goes hand in hand with scale, because you're able to do things so much faster. And so it's not the enemy. It's it's really kind of your best friend. So.
Yeah, it's interesting also sort of a little bit of the shift I think IT companies are starting to make in terms of automation is being more enabling for their teams to sort of tackle and jump into doing even small bits of automation here. I've gotten into it myself, writing a script for this, or I like the saying, if you have to do something manually the first time, shame on the task. But if you have to do something manually twice, shame on you, because
Yeah,
at this point you should be thinking of automating some of those tasks. And I think that will definitely be one of the big efficiency creators for MSPs, in that sort of do more with less challenge.
yeah.
Very interesting.
And the machine learning based tools are getting better too, and so it'll automate smarter, right?
Yeah.
And that's a big thing as well too. So
I do think it's a bit of that continuum, right? You can't look at as automation as an event necessarily, but sort of a journey. And I think just getting started is often the quickest path to success. Is a lot of people just never get started because they see it as a big mountain to climb, and even the person that may not be super PowerShell friendly or Bash scripting friendly just sort of may feel that it's difficult to get started. But my advice there is simply find a task that you need to accomplish and just set out to try and complete it with a script or something like that may often just help you down that line of, hey, this is actually not too bad, and it's easy to get started. And there's a lot of great resources, by the way, for those of you chiming in today. Folks in the industry like Kelvin Tegelar, a Dutch MSP CTO, who is awesome at providing a lot of useful information in his blog. I'll paste it in the chat, but his blog is called Cyberdrain. And Cyberdrain, he publishes so many useful PowerShell scripts and just scripts and things like that to automate everything from 365 provisioning to logging to reporting to changes, and the kind of stuff that becomes tedious manual tasks when you have to do them over and over and over again. So check his blog out. Kelvin is really great. He's an awesome community guy, and I think you'll appreciate some of the depth that he goes into with some of this
the
scripting.
process I've described is for people to think of it more as, I've used the phrase chip shots, not moonshots, right? So if you were to sit down and talk to a data center manager and think about the process of moving to a fully software-defined data center, well, there's so much to do there, right? That sort of moonshot goal is so overwhelming that you're never going to do it.
Mm.
Just like if you ask a retailer to become Amazon overnight, right? They're not going to do it because you can't, right? It's such a big moonshot. But if you think of it more as a series of little chip shots, like what's the one thing you can do now, right? That can help you, improve IT. So if you can automate maybe just like network updates, or if you can automate your backups, or you can automate, I don't know, like automate warning you from a network management perspective once you hit a certain deviation over the baseline, right? Just if there's a couple of things you can do, those little chip shot initiatives are doable, but they're not so onerous that it's going to paralyze you.
Yeah, and I definitely think necessity being the mother of invention is definitely the underlying theme here. A perfect example of that, like you gave just now, is turning on mailbox auditing in Office 365 is something that's not turned on by default. And if you have to go do it manually one time, it's fine. But having to do it every single time you bring on a new client or every single time you create a new mailbox, this kind of stuff becomes a real tedious thing to do. And it just lengthens your sort of new user creation process. And it just creates so many sort of backstops for the process to slow down. But once you sort of set out, okay, well, let me see if I can automate this with PowerShell, and you realize, oh, I could actually set up an Azure function to do this because Azure has the ability to automate these things for me. And now you go down the path of, oh, let's figure out how to do an Azure function. These things can become really interesting to do once you're set up with automation. I gotta say, it's one of the most gratifying feelings. It's sort of that, yeah, I did it kind of thing, and I get a kick out of it every single time. So starting somewhere, yeah, good points there. Shadow IT and data ownership. This is sort of a bare topic because I think even small business is obviously exposed to this a lot. People going out buying their own tools or just using whatever they want or can because they can't solve their problem or need quickly enough. But you must see this across the enterprise with some of the larger customers as well.
Yeah, shadow IT. Yeah, to me, it's one of the single biggest problems facing IT today. When I was in IT, we controlled everything. We controlled the device you use. We controlled when you could, even we had access privilege, right? The when you could work. We controlled how you came into the company. We controlled the apps you used. I had the script I wrote that would go look at everybody's computer and eliminate all the MP3s, MPEGs, JPEGs, things like that off their machines, because we locked them all down, right? And remember when I was in Baltimore at the time and somebody had put a Raven screensaver on their computer, and I'm like, well, who told you could do that, right? So, but now the model's quite different, where lines of business are buying a lot of their IT, and if you don't give people the tools that they want, it's a little bit like, if you remember the Jurassic Park, when Jeff Goldblum said, life finds a way, right? Workers find a way, and they want to do their jobs, and sometimes you give them tools. Like, you think of a company that doesn't allow like external file sharing, well, people go by Dropbox, right? Or if you have email size limits on your corporate email, well, guess what? People start using Gmail. And so people will find a way. And I think sometimes CIOs don't really understand how big this problem is. I've worked with a lot of companies doing cloud audits, and the most egregious misconception was one CIO said he thought they had like 30 to 50 cloud apps being used. They had like 700, and a lot of them were one-off things. There's one person using Join Me or something like that, right? But you're right, from a data ownership perspective, especially in regulated industries, this is a big problem, because people are putting data, especially a lot of times sensitive data, into cloud-based systems that don't have the same type of corporate security capabilities, or multi-factor,
or governance for that matter.
Or governance, or whatever that's required. So there's not for companies out there that don't think shadow IT is a big problem, just don't know it's a problem. Because it is. And I like I said, I think it's one of the biggest problems facing IT today. And users are pretty. The big difference today versus like when I was in IT 20 years ago is users aren't scared of technology either, right? It used to be, I remember when I was at a company, like, this is 1990. I started working at this company, and they were using DOS machines still, and we were ripping out the DOS machines and putting in Windows. Nobody wanted the Windows machines because they were so used to working, a certain way. Now that's not the case. Everybody wants the latest and greatest, right? And so if you're not, so you've got to constantly be supporting that. And so if you're not giving it to them, that's why Zoom saw such a rise, because people wanted the kind of easy to use tool with all of the bells and whistles, and people were just going out and paying for it themselves, right? So, Salesforce started that way. Salesforce was a shadow IT procured set of tools, because the standard back then for CRM was SAP and Oracle, and Salesforce ended around that, went directly to the salespeople, and then eventually it got so much penetration that it became the corporate standard. So you do need to, companies do need to think about, ease of use and things, and too often users adopt this stuff because the tools that we recommend they use, are too complicated. I know lots of companies that are, they pay the Office 365 license, and so they're trying to give everybody Microsoft Teams, but frankly, Teams stinks. Zoom's a lot easier to use, and so the users go out and use that, and then all of a sudden they're supporting two of them.
Well, the other thing is the visibility is also improving for IT teams, like the type of reporting that you can get now from a 365 environment that tells you when people are signing in with their 365 accounts into some third-party app using single sign-on or using some kind of OAuth. The reporting that's coming out of these things is now really interesting, because now you can actually see, oh, well, you have so many users actually signing into this third-party app or tool or what have you that we didn't know about. And so I think the dynamic is changing in the sense that IT can now become an enabler rather than sort of a blocker. And I think this is one of the interesting things about shadow ITs. The missing visibility was the biggest problem before, but that is also quickly changing.
Yeah, and all the cloud, big Glass is a good CASB tools, so most of the security vendors. So the CASB tools have helped a lot because they bring a lot of visibility to things you just didn't have visibility into before. And then it can even help you, understand people's work styles and things, and it might even help you decide what should be your corporate standard for certain apps. If you've got an overwhelming number of users, using Dropbox, then see if you can buy an enterprise license from them. You might save yourself companies some money.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Certainly a challenge for SMB as well. And I see a lot of MSPs sort of struggle with just the control factor of just wanting to lock everything down because they didn't allow it or didn't have knowledge of it. And sort of that shift to being an enabler, I think, will be a key transition.
Yeah, and if you lock things down too tight, you'll lose those employees.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
The other big word of 2020, digital transformation, and this one gets thrown around, freely. And this is one of those interesting things that I think is not like digital transformation should not be looked at as an event. It's really sort of a continuum of things that need to happen over time. And I think we make the mistake of thinking, oh, we're going to digitally transform you next week. And that's not how it's going to happen. People need to start adopting certain smaller changes and be able to sort of grow into some of the transition. But a lot of what happens, I think, in small business, often we see driven by SMEs or the enterprise in general. I know this is a place where you've seen a ton of stuff happening. What are your thoughts on digital transformation?
I guess it's hard to have a thought on it, right? You're right. It's a continuum, and just a continuous process of how I use new technology to change my business process. And this is where this is where you have to have the willingness to constantly reinvent your organization, even if it creates you some discomfort. I attended Amazon's reInvent a couple of weeks ago, and if you go to siliconangle.com, actually my last post there was here, I can actually put it out there if you want, but was Andy Jassy's 8 Steps to Reinventing Business, right? And that's really I'll post it in there too. That's really what digital transformation does. It lets you constantly, oops, I put it to organizers only, so you'll have to do it.
I'll repaste it for everyone.
Yeah, but it does let you. So digital transformation is about that concept of reinvention and how I use new technology. So a good example is the one I gave you, the coffee shops, right? That if you didn't have the ability to online order when the pandemic started, you might not be in business today. So having that capability, even though you might think that, well, our demographic doesn't want that, right? So same with the contact center space. A lot of organizations, fail. I was at years ago. I was at one of the NHL teams talking with the manager that runs a contact center there, and they're still running voice only. I'm like, you're not talking to the season ticket holders over chat and he goes, no, our ticket holder base doesn't really want that. I'm like, I don't want that because you're not giving it to them. Right? So you do have to think about ways, because there's so many. The battle for the entertainment dollar, and for any dollars, is so high, right? And one of the interesting stats I got from my research last year is 2/3 of millennials admitted they changed loyalties to a brand because of a single bad experience. And bad experience doesn't mean I go into a store and somebody's rude to me. It just means the process of buying something from you could be difficult.
Sure.
Or when I called into your contact center, I had to go through 6 different people before I could get a refund, right? Things like that. And they might have been the friendliest people in the world, but if you don't give them the right tools, right, to stay current, then you're putting your organization in a negative position. And so digital transformation is an ongoing journey about how to use technology to create different business processes that will keep you current. And to me, there's no greater sign for the impact of this than what we've seen with a lot of the big brands over the last 20 years, right? The Radio Shacks and CompUSAs and companies like that everybody knew, they're all gone. Like a lot of those are gone. And people can blame Amazon and things like that, but it's not Jeff Bezos' fault that Toys R Us didn't modernize their store ever, right? That those things were going to happen, and they just, Amazon maybe made that faster. But I do think, this is really the key to becoming a market leader and staying out in front is having the ability to kind of look around the corner and understand how you use that to attract a new breed of people. Same thing with banks, right? A lot of them didn't want to get into online money transfers until PayPal and Venmo did, and now they're all forced to.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting challenge for MSPs or IT providers is maybe helping their customers think omni-channel, right?
Yeah.
How do they think of other ways to reach their customers, and how do they stay on top of that from a technology perspective? Obviously, I have the firsthand experience of my wife who owns a brick and mortar candy shop here in Vancouver. The pandemic kind of forced her to close her doors, but fortunately she had a Shopify thing online and she was able to make that transition and not skip a beat, so to speak. Obviously sales are down and all that stuff because the store relied a ton on the walk-in traffic and all that, but had there not been sort of this strategy of the omni-channel, hey, we're going to sell in the store but we're also going to sell online, it would have been death to that business pretty much
Yeah.
instantaneously. So yeah, I think the challenge for IT providers is think of how your customers need to expand into other channels and what technology they're going to use to do that, because those are some of the big project opportunities I think coming into
Even just
2020.
ones, how do you social and things like that.
Yeah,
There's some where I'll put up on Twitter my dissatisfaction with the vendor. Sometimes the vendor gets back to me right away. Other ones, other times they don't, right? And um, there's a big chasm here between companies that understand how to be digital and ones that don't, and that chasm is really creating a wider gap between companies. And I think over the next 5-6 years, we're going to see a complete turnover, in the companies we think of as leaders. Look at the Airbnb just IPO, right? So this is a company that owns, how many properties does Airbnb actually own, right?
zero.
None.
Yeah,
Yeah, and their market cap is bigger than Marriott, Hilton, and Hyatt combined,
I was
right?
seeing that article this week. Yeah,
So that's pretty
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I think it also speaks to just it's actually mind-boggling to think of that statement. When I remember reading it in one of the news headlines this week, I was like, is this possible? Like, how does that even happen? And I think obviously people's thirst for technology-driven solutions or simplicity and or sort of the not giving up convenience is sort of a key point of valuation, I think, is how you can think of it. And so I think small businesses will drive a lot of our decisions that way as well, is making sure that we're not helping them sacrifice convenience, because they'll find somebody that gives them the convenience. They'll find the tools that give them the simplicity, and if we're not part of that equation, obviously we'll lose that opportunity. But so awesome points. Um, this is sort of our last topic for today, which is some of the predictions for 2021, and we shot around some topics when we had our pre-call, and one of those topics that I'm just going to pull up right now is this idea of let me see here my notes, the platform approach. Especially around things like EDR and the transition to XDR and sort of having visibility around multiple bits of information. You had some thoughts on that specifically.
Yeah, I think we talk about platforms all the time, but I think what platforms do is they create a bigger, consistent set of data. And if you believe that IT is becoming more analytic driven, either through machine learning or other ways, then the ability to have a larger data set, right, makes a difference. And in the security world, it's a good example where if you think about how like endpoint detection tools. In fact, in 2018, I wrote a report declaring EDR to be dead, long live XDR. That was sort of tongue in cheek, but in some ways, it was I did mean it, right? Where if you look at a tool like an EDR, which is an endpoint tool, it does a good job of the D in that it can recognize the problem on the endpoint. But because its data set is limited to the endpoint, unless the problem emanated on the endpoint, it would know. So if the breach occurred somewhere else down in the network, it's going to have no idea. So that's why most EDR tools do a good job with the D, but not so much the R. Right? XDR is extended detection and response, in which the security platform vendors, be it a Fortinet, Palo Alto, Cisco, something like that, do have knowledge of cloud endpoint security. They know what's going on, sort of in DNS. Most of the, SolarWinds and companies that have been trying to do that for a while, where if you have kind of knowledge of all these different areas, then when you do see a breach happen, you can sort of trace it back to where the source is, and therefore remediate against it faster, right? And so even being able to have that kind of that platform approach, even from a, and just looking for those anomalies from baseline can often indicate to you that something's amiss and indicate a breach. And so, that platform capability has become true in security. If you look in the communications world, everybody wants to be a meeting, phone, team provider, because you get a broader set of data and an understanding of how people are working. In the contact center, you're buying all your omni-channel tools from one company because it gives you a better idea of what your customers are doing, right? You're tying them into CRM tools. And so this concept of the platform has become a reality. And I think the thing that vendors are doing now is they're actually making real platforms. It's not they're just cobbling together multiple data sets. In fact, there's a couple of vendors that I used to poke at all the time saying that they're the market leaders in single panes of glass because they have one for everything. And that's not really right.
So true.
But I will say the industry's been more focused on it. So.
An interesting question I get, sort of to shift to our next prediction. I've had a customer ask me this in the last year, but the question was, and a customer, I mean a customer of my MSP, sort of a small business. The question was, is there, can we like turn on AI or can we use AI in the business somehow? And this is sort of an interesting, I think, challenge for technology providers and MSPs in general is like, I think we're going to be the users of products that start to leverage more AI and machine learning. But in many cases, small businesses, they may adopt some SaaS product or some other cloud tool that's leveraging AI specifically. But do you feel that that IT providers will be the implementers of AI-driven technology or more of the adopters of that type of technology?
Oh no, AI and ML are being built into almost all IT tools being being created anyways. And so I was talking with some of this the other day where I think AI has to become almost invisible, right? Where you don't even know it's there. And so you think of a tool like SolarWinds that alerts you on things. Well, one of the criticisms it alerts me on too many things, right? And if you think of every big breach that's occurred in the last decade or so, the SIM vendor always claimed they found it, but nobody reacted to it because there's so much data being given. So if AI, is sort of working in the background, reduces a lot of the noise, and only shows you things that are important, now the tool is going to work better because of that, right? So I think, that I know there's a lot of, you can't hire enough data scientists today, but I don't expect most companies to be their own AI shops. I expect them to leverage the tools that are already there, and even the cloud companies, Amazon, and Google, and they partner with NVIDIA and they bring homegrown AI toolkits to market now, right? So companies don't have to go through the process of building their own learning. A good example of that is natural language is language translation.
Yeah.
Right. Amazon
holding up your phone.
Yeah. Well, so Amazon's had the capability for a long time, but it required you training an algorithm to speak different languages, and who's going to do that? So Amazon went and did that, but now you can buy ML-based translation directly from them, and that simplifies the adoption of it.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I also see, kind of as vendors start to adopt more of the machine learning and AI and incorporate into their products, I also see a bunch of consolidation happening in the industry, and you've actually sort of been following a lot of that consolidation. Very vertically focused vendors starting to get into other industries to expand a little bit on their footprint, if you will. The example of like Vonage buying Blue Jeans, for example, but there are probably other examples you've been tracking this year. What are your thoughts on sort of this consolidation happening?
Yeah, there's been a ton of that. It was Verizon that bought Blue Jeans. Plantronics and Polycom merged. There's been Palo Alto seems like it's constantly buying companies. So Cisco, there's just been the steady state of acquisitions. One of the more interesting companies that went through some acquisitions was NVIDIA, right? They make chips, but then they went up and bought a network company with Mellanox and Cumulus, and so they're building bigger systems. And so this problem that IT has of I got to buy networking from this company and compute from this company, and kind of stitch everything together with my data center, the vendors through acquisitions and partnerships are trying to make that simpler, right? And
Right.
you know, HP bought Silver Peak and they bought Aruba the year before, so now they're not just a campus networking company. They have data center, they have SD-WAN, they have Wi-Fi, right? Extreme Networks has done a big roll up on their side as well. And so up and down the stack, you see companies buying companies to try and, you know, bring that platform to market.
Yeah, which kind of brings up the last question or last prediction that I know we wanted to talk about, and it's this consolidation obviously creates opportunities for those vendors to get into other businesses or other lines of revenue opportunity. And I think this is an area that MSPs are constantly thinking about. It's like, what other places can I create some additional revenue opportunities for the business? And so I'm curious to know what some of your biggest opportunities for revenue streams you think coming into 2021 might be for IT providers and MSPs.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff going on in network for managed service providers. I did a work from anywhere study over the summer, and one of the data points I had was that 60% of companies, I think it was, would either use managed or co-managed service to adopt SD-WAN. Now, historically, the use case of managed service providers for WAN has been about 25 to 30%. We're
Yeah,
talking
not very
double
much.
that, right?
Yeah.
And the problem is, so what MSPs want to look for is anything that's complicated, right? So the old way of deploying a WAN, it's simple math, right? If you have an equation with one variable, it's easy to solve. If you have an equation with 10 variables, it's harder to solve. And so the old way of deploying a WAN had one variable. It was hub and spoke, and you kind of had one way to deploy it. Now with SASE and SD-WAN, you know, there's a lot of questions. Do I keep my MPLS? Where do I use broadband? Do I bring in wireless technologies? Do I go fully mesh? Do I keep it hub and spoke? Do I go regional hub, partial mesh? Where do I put my security? Is it in the cloud? Do I,
Yeah.
again, is it regional hub? Do I keep it on-prem? How do I cloud manage that? Right. So there's a lot of questions that are being asked about that. And I think and in addition to that, security and networking are coming together. So that adds another layer of security complexity on that. And so, you know, it's interesting because ease of use and agility sometimes, you know, does require some complexity to make things easy. So you think of, like, you know, you'd mentioned the iPhone, right? So you think of the engineering that goes in this thing to make it easy to use, right? Similarly, if I want a network that's fully automated and runs itself, there's a whole bunch of work that I got to go into to set that up. And I think
Yeah.
that's where business is up. Now, one word of caution for MSPs, right, is you're going to be selling things that are a lot more subscription based, right? If I sell any of the collaboration tools today, or even network management tools that are cloud management tools, they're all subscription based. People don't renew things they don't use. So this is where MSPs need to adopt this concept of having a true customer success team that's making sure that customers are using the tools that they're buying properly. And
Interesting.
yeah, and I think from that standpoint, if you do that, it changes your role with your customer. So, but I think in the area of network security, cloud adoption, there's really, I don't know if there's been a better time to be an MSP, because we're moving into an era where IT lets you do so much more than you could have before. We could never have had everybody working from home 10 years ago, right? It just wouldn't have worked, but we can do that
Yeah.
today. But the path to get there does have a bunch of landmines in it, and MSPs can help, you know, customers avoid all of those.
Yeah, and I think the challenge, like you've just sort of hit on the head of the nail, is that MSPs have traditionally just focused on the IT or technical deployment aspect of some of these things. It's like, hey, here's the Office 365 description we created, or a subscription we created, your users, off you go, kind of thing. Where the big opportunity is actually helping that customer adopt Teams or adopt Zoom or adopt WebEx or whatever technology they're actually looking to deploy in their environment. I think that's where sort of that additional articulation of value can come from as well, which is another big challenge for MSPs. Is like, you know, we're going to get more and more as we have customers moving into cloud or hybrid solutions. You know, what are we paying you for, kind of question. And so I think the whole value prop of MSPs needs to shift along with those needs too.
Yeah.
Well, Zeus, this has been fascinating, Chad. We're at the top of the hour, so I can't believe we were going to originally talk for half an hour, and here we are an hour later. I appreciate all your insight into all of this. Thank you, everyone, for attending. As I mentioned, we will have a follow-up email with the recording to the session. There's such a lot of great ideas here, and I hope this is sort of triggering some folks to think about what they might tackle in 2021 as a strategic initiative with customers. But awesome insight. For anybody interested, please follow Zeus on Twitter. I think you have a blog, your own blog post on the website, correct? At ZK Research?
Yeah, I have one on my own website. If you look, I have a YouTube channel now in which I'm starting up a podcast series next year, and you can find me on a whole bunch of different, like I said, eWeek, Silicon Angle, Network World, CIO, Forbes, No Jitter, right? There's a bunch of, I primarily put everything either on my website or on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, you'll see most of the stuff.
Awesome. Zeus, well, thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending this hour of your time with us this morning chatting about these interesting topics. I hope you have a great rest of your day in Toronto. I hope the Airbnb experience is wonderful as they've designed it to be. And for everybody else that attended today, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.